5, 4, 3, 2, 1, drop that.
Welcome to the Test Guild Automation Podcast. We're all getting together to learn more about software testing and automation with your host, Joe Colantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Nikolay Advolodkin all about his post on 11 automated testing best practices and some red flags you need to be aware of. And he also has an awesome new course coming out called the Complete Selenium-Webdriver with Java Bootcamp. Nikolay is a self-driven SDAT on a lifelong mission to create profound change in the IT world. He loves to code. He's also a solution architect at SauceLabs, and he is the founder of Ultimate QA, where he has a bunch of highly rated courses around automated testing that you definitely need to check out. You don't want to miss this episode. Check it out. The Test Guild Automation Podcast is sponsored by the fantastic folks at SauceLabs. Their cloud-based test platform helps ensure your favorite mobile apps and websites work flawlessly on every browser, operating system, and device. Get a free trial. Visit testguild.com/SauceLabs and click on the exclusive sponsor section to try it for free for 14 days. Check it out. Hey, Nikolay, welcome to the show.
Hey, Joe. Thank you so much for having me, man. Super excited to be back on your show.
Awesome. Always love speaking with you. Love to have you on the show. You have a bunch of knowledge. What have you been up to since last time we talked? It's been a while. I don't know if we even talked on this show since you got your new gig at SauceLabs.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think this is my third appearance here. And I think it's been, already at least 3 or 4 years since the last time I was on here. Since last time we talked, a lot, of course, has happened in my life. But one of the main things is I started working as a senior solution architect at SauceLabs, which is a really cool position because before I was kind of just, working for different kinds of companies, helping them implement test automation. But you are kind of in your own little world where you see the problems that you're focused on. And now I'm on this solution architect role where I get to basically work with tons of companies, probably 12 to 20 companies a year from all over the world with many, many different automation engineers. And I get to see many different kinds of problems that everybody's facing. And it gives me a better outlook into what's really going on in the industry. So that's been a very cool role to see everything that's going on. And of course, that allowed me to create better content to help serve and provide more value to more people.
Nice. So at a high level, how's your outlook changed? Have you seen somebody like, wow, I didn't even know this was a real issue, but after speaking with all these clients, that's a thing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Some of the main things that I've learned that I guess basically are going on are, I didn't know that BDD automation is such a big problem in the industry. I personally have never used BDD or have never worked in a BDD environment. So I've never needed to use BDD automation tools, such as Cucumber to do my test automation. But then stepping out into the industry, I, number one, realized how big it is, how a lot of companies are trying to do BDD, but ultimately they're not doing BDD at all. Rather, they end up skipping over all the collaboration pieces, the communication problems that BDD is supposed to solve, and instead they just use Cucumber to do UI automation, for example. So they're using these tools that are pretty much inferior in terms of technology and also more challenging because they introduce more dependencies and more barriers to entry to try their automation. And so it just ends up being harder and harder to maintain, harder to execute. And so they get into a lot more trouble. So that's one of the main things that I've learned and seen. And I've been actually really passionate about this topic recently, trying to basically discourage people and telling them, hey, please stop using Cucumber just for the sake of automation. That's not its purpose. You're supposed to be doing BDD. You're supposed to be working with your three amigos to solve communication problems, not inserting a tool hoping that it will solve your automation problems, because actually it will cause more automation problems. And we always talk with my team. We got a team of about 8 solution architects, and between all of us, we have 100 years of test automation experience, close to 100 years. And of course, from different areas. And we've seen like one good implementation of automation with Cucumber. And that was actually from Aslak Helsoy, the creator of Cucumber.
Now, this is one of my pet peeves. I don't want to make the show about this, but I worked for a large enterprise that totally perverted BDD, and it was a nightmare. And like you said, it just adds an extra layer. And if you're not using it for communication, it's like an extra layer you don't need. To me, it just adds more issues than what it solves if you're just using it as a framework, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's exactly what we see is it doesn't solve the collaboration problems. That BDD, it's a methodology that was designed to solve it. And it just becomes another, I don't know why we do this in the industry. I always ponder this. I feel like we will read something for like an hour, right? Like agile, for example, we will hear agile. Agile will become this huge buzzword. We'll read something for an hour. We'll be like, oh, this sounds great. I'm going to do stand-ups. But instead of doing stand-ups with like your little team of 4 to 8 people, you do stand-ups of 30 people every single day where people just kind of report what they do. And they're like, oh, I'm doing agile, even though you're really doing waterfall methodologies with just a piece of agile. And same thing, I think, happened with BDD, where someone heard, oh, BDD, it's supposed to solve all our problems. So let's just use Cucumber tools, and then that will, fix our stuff. And it doesn't. And yeah, I guess another example of abusing something without fully understanding it.
Awesome. So, Nikolay, I know you have a bunch of other best practices you recommend. And so I just want to dive into this blog post a little bit to kind of tease them out a little. One of them is another, not a pet peeve, but something I know a lot of people have been talking about for a while, and I still curious to know if you see it as an issue in the industry, and that is people not really writing their tests as an atomic test. So, what is an atomic test, and what are your thoughts on how that's being implemented, and what you've seen from all the different customers you deal with?
Yeah, awesome question, Joe. Yeah, I think if I were to kind of pinpoint the two largest problems in the industry that I keep seeing is, number one, people not doing BDD and just instead using BDD automation tools to solve their problems. Number two is not having atomic tests. Atomic tests are basically a test that will test only a single feature. So for example, can a user add an item to a cart? Can a user check out with an item that has been added to the cart? So that's testing a single feature versus, for example, something like logging in, adding an item to a cart, then checking out with that item, then making sure that item was shipped or something like that, versus like these end-to-end flow tests, right? Screen to screen flow tests. Those are end-to-end. Those are non-atomic tests. You also know you have an atomic test when you have like 2 assertions at most, potentially 3. I would love to see some use cases of why you need 3 assertions in your atomic test. I haven't had the need to do 3 assertions, but of course it may be possible. But usually what I've seen, 2 at most, because sometimes with an atomic test, what you need to do is set up the state of an atomic test first. So for example, if we go back to checking out with an item in a cart feature. So a lot of us, what we'll do is we will log in as some user, we will search for an item, we will add an item to a cart, and then we will test the checkout feature. But before that, we did all of these extra UI interactions that were not really necessary. And all of these UI interactions, what they actually end up doing is, first, you have to write the code, which obviously takes time. Then you also introduce extra flakiness, right? Because we all know with UI automation, every UI interaction is a chance for something to go wrong. It's a chance for invalid element locator. It's a chance for a synchronization problem. So the more we have of those, the more problems we introduce into our test. And also, of course, the slower our tests become. So what you want to do with an atomic test is basically isolate the piece that you want to test through the UI, and the rest of the stuff you want to do through other layers. So for example, with adding an item to a cart, I actually covered that in depth in my blog post. I'm sure Joe will link to it. But what you can do is our website, it is a dummy website to do your test automation. So it doesn't fully represent how a real web application would perform. But what you can do on this website is you can drop an item to a cart simply by executing some JavaScript. So you can say, I want to put this item into the cart and you execute one line of code, JavaScript, not even a UI interaction, it will drop an item into the cart. You open up the exact page with the cart. So far you've done 0 UI actions, and now you can introduce your UI automation framework to start actually filling out the form and finishing the checkout process to make sure that a user can check out with their item. And so it's basically isolating the piece that you don't want to do and doing it at either an API layer. You can do it at the JavaScript layer. You can do stuff like cookies. A lot of people keep logging in to their applications, and we almost never need to log in to our applications through the UI. There's always an authentication API that you can hit. You can get back a cookie, drop that cookie into your browser, and now you'll be automatically logged in, and you can bypass that whole login process and you can start attacking your UI with your UI automation framework at that point.
Nice. And that's what I see people usually, why they say they can't do atomic tests, because they always say, oh, I have dependencies. Like I need a patient and the patient needs to be checked in and they need to have an operation before I can build them. And it sounds like there are 3 ways that you can get around that. And you said cookies, JavaScript, and APIs can usually get you around those different dependencies. So that helps you to make the test more atomic. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, you got it exactly right, Joe. And thanks for bringing that up. And there's actually a 4th way that you can do that as well. The 4th way is database manipulations, right? So what you kind of talked about, having a patient registered, what that ultimately means is that in the back end, you have some rows of data in your database that have some specific criteria, right? There's this patient. She is a 45-year-old female with 2 children, right? You need that patient in order to be able to work with your application. So what you can do is actually go into your database. You can create that user, and then you can utilize the data from that user in your application, and then perform your UI stuff rather than actually filling out forms in the UI. And then you utilize that patient, you perform your operations in the UI, and then of course you want to make sure that you clean up because you don't want to be filling up your database with test users. One other thing that I wanted to point out here is I kind of sit and talk about it. Maybe I make it sound easy, maybe I don't, but I don't want anyone to think that this is an easy process. In some organizations where the technology is more up to date, where we have RESTful APIs available, stuff like this is drastically easier. In other organizations that I've worked with, like large organizations, banks especially, it's a lot harder because what ends up happening is they will have a lot of legacy systems that are not maybe hooked up to like a RESTful API or even a SOAP API. And so then what that becomes is a challenge of having different organizations coming together to define like an interface where, the different organizations can interact with each other to make not only their development easier, but also their test automation easier. So it can be really big challenges, but if you work through those challenges and you work towards the goal of achieving atomic tests, you will notice that pretty much all of the problems that we always complain about with UI test automation, they'll be solved. Flakiness will disappear simply because you're doing so few UI interactions that flakiness is not even a problem. Tests become extremely fast. Like whenever you have atomic tests, I recommend maximum 30 seconds on your local resources, which means that you can easily run 100 tests in 30 seconds if you have 100 parallel machines that you can run. And so your UI automation becomes extremely fast, it becomes extremely reliable, and it becomes no longer a bottleneck in your continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines. People begin to trust it and actually use it as a way to gauge the quality of the software.
Awesome. I think another benefit, maybe I'm wrong, is the ability to debug quickly if one of these tests fail, because it is atomic. So when it fails, if you name it correctly, patient check-in failed, the patient check-in failed, not that there's other steps that you had to do before to get there that failed. Is there benefits to using these tests to debug quicker, I guess, when the tests are atomic?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Joe. Yeah, it's exactly right. So imagine we go back to our can a user check out with an item test, right? That's actually a little tiny test. We find many users will have much longer tests, 30-minute tests, 1-hour tests. I've had users asking me if they can run a 4-hour test. They want to run a 4-hour UI test. And I was just like, my gosh, like what do you need to do for 4 hours to be testing, but anyway, that's totally separate road. Let's not go down that road. But yeah, so if you go back to our checkout situation, right? If you're attempting to log in as the user and the user isn't able to log in for some reason, right? Maybe your test username and credentials expired. Maybe your UI automation is not stable enough, and so there's weird stuff going on and it breaks, right? And so it breaks at that point, but your test where that fails says user should be able to check out with item. And so that's the test that fails. And you see that is the test that failed, but you get a different exception saying element not found exception or some other weird exception. And so now you don't exactly know the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is not that the user wasn't able to check out with an item. The root cause of the problem was that the user wasn't able to log in. And so what ended up happening was you're not only not testing whether the user is able to check out, you're also getting a false positive on that test. And so now you have to spend time debugging, figuring out what really happened. And then at the end of the day, you find out that it was totally unrelated issue that you could have had a totally separate test for, right? You could have had a small atomic test that says user should be able to log in, right? And that is where you actually try to log in through the UI. And if that doesn't work, your test would have failed. That test would have come back as failed. You would have seen, oh, user should be able to log in. That failed. So I know that a user cannot log in because that was the only thing that was being tested.
So besides making tests atomic, is there other ways we can write our tests to make them more reliable? For example, I know you do cover some best practices like page objects or the page object pattern. Is this still a valid approach you think people should be following, or is that outdated, or are there newer methods you can use?
Yeah, so in terms of the page object pattern, one thing that I just keep seeing in the industry, and I think it just falls onto the fact that we all just need more training. Basically, we just keep seeing how people are over engineering solutions and always reinventing the wheel. They're always trying to create a new way to tackle the same problems that have already been resolved. And I don't blame anyone for that, any individual person. I think it kind of falls on us as the industry. We're still kind of young, I would say, and we still need a lot more work, where I feel like organizations, a lot of time, they will take a manual tester or take someone with a little bit of coding experience and say, hey, you're going to do automation now. I'm going to provide you 1 day of training, sometimes no training at all. And they're just like, oh, figure it out on the way, and let's cross our fingers and hope that automation works. And that's not really fair to anybody, right? Unless they have a lot of free time on their own to sit and research these problems and really dig into it. We need a lot of training, test automation and software development. We need weeks and weeks of solid training in this to be able to solve the problem. So sorry, I went off on a tangent, but coming back to the idea that page object pattern has been around since 2004, 2005. It's a fantastic pattern to follow. It solves the problems that we needed to solve, which is just basically reducing duplication, creating good abstractions of our pages so that it's easier to understand where everything belongs. That isn't the problem in our industry. So I wouldn't recommend to be reinventing that wheel and trying to create a new way of encapsulating objects, a new way of abstracting information. Stick with the page object pattern, the one that is exactly defined. Put your methods and your properties in your page objects. A page object also doesn't even have to be an entire HTML page. It's a little annoying because it's an unfortunate name for page object pattern, but it can also be a single component. So if you have a header or sidebars in your website, you can put those into a page object, or also you can call it a page component. And so because that exists everywhere, you can use that page component in all the places you need to use it. And so it doesn't only need to be an entire HTML page. So you can make sure you break those components down. And yeah, just keep using it. Keep it simple and really focus on the major problems like achieving atomic tests and solving being able to automate at different layers, different responsibilities, right? Making sure that you have unit tests, making sure that you have API tests, and with a little bit of UI test automation, combining all of those to provide the best coverage and create the highest quality software in the fastest time possible. Those are the major problems to solve, not whether page object pattern is good or not. It's good enough to solve the problems that we have today.
Nice. So another, you cover this, is the anti-pattern of people using Excel or complicated data stores such as Excel. I see a lot of people struggling with test data management with their test scripts. So is this anti-pattern along those lines? Like, is that something you've been seeing yourself with people struggling with test data management and how to solve it?
Yeah, good point, Joe. So thank God that I don't see people using Excel too often nowadays for their test data management. I know where it came from. I actually used to do it myself. I know that back in the day, like a decade ago or more than a decade ago, we used to do keyword-driven testing, which was super popular with QTP. I don't know if anybody knows QTP. Now it's called UFT. They had a bunch of different transitions. At one point, it was Mercury, owned by Mercury Interactive. So we used to do that because we had some belief that potentially we could integrate manual testers into our test automation and store our data in Excel, and that would make it easier for team collaboration. And maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but nowadays it's way too complicated and requires a lot of code, and to be managing an external COM object to be able to read and write test data for our automation, it's unnecessary. There are many better ways to do it, such as you can read from a JSON file, an XML, a database. You can even read from like different APIs. A lot of organizations now do have APIs available where you just hit the API, get the data that you want, use it, and you can even delete it afterwards. So there are, again, going back to that idea of keeping things simple and not making things complicated. There are simpler ways to solve that problem than Excel. We don't need Excel anymore. A lot of people will come and tell me, hey, but I want my manual testers to be reading this data or to be writing this data. I don't know if that's a valid use case. It's not the manual tester's job to really be managing your test data. You're the automation engineer. You should make sure that your system is as stable as possible so that, number one, it's reliable, but also if you really do need to work with a manual testing team to work with some data, you can show them how to write it into a JSON or an XML format or into a database, because it's a valuable skill for them to learn as well, because that's what's relevant in the world today.
Now, Nikolay, I'll be honest. One of these points, maybe I'm not understanding it correctly. I'm kind of surprised by. You said avoid retry logic and test automation. And just let me give you my point of view is that, I've been doing this for 20 years. I find it impossible to make web UI automation 100% foolproof. And when it fails, it's usually something stupid, like it's a glitch or a weight or something that's slightly off. So adding a retry to some of these things have made the test more reliable. But you say avoid retry logic. So what's your thought behind why you say avoid retry logic in test automation?
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much for bringing that up, Joe. And I'm glad you told me that you don't 100% agree. Yeah, keep in mind that a lot of this stuff is obviously my opinion. It's my opinion from experience, of course, my opinion from experience not working with other solution architects whom we have combined 100 years of test automation experience, but also just from experience with working with, about 20 different clients across the globe every single year and seeing all these patterns. So they are my opinions. I hope that through my conversation here and through my logic, it will help to influence some decisions in the test automation world and will help some people make better automation decisions. But if it doesn't, that's totally cool too. I'm really happy to have these conversations. So back to the retry logic. The reason why I believe you shouldn't have a retry logic in your test automation is because if you think about fundamentally what a retry means about your code, it automatically implies that you don't trust the results of your failed test. Because if you say, oh, I'm going to automatically retry if the test fails, that says that you don't trust the results of that test. Because if you're going to automatically retry, then that that's exactly what's happening. And so what it also tells me is that potentially the not incorrect strategies are being applied to the test automation to introduce this kind of flakiness. And so one of the ways to not need retry logic is to have atomic tests. If you have atomic tests that only test what they need to do through the UI, for example, and the rest of the stuff is done through other layers, you will not need retry logic, because if your test fails for a specific reason, it will only be that reason. So again, going back to our checkout example, if you're only checking that a user can successfully, so let me break down the test. So now part one is you want to open the page, right? Opening the page, that of course can fail on its own because maybe something is up with the database and your page is not rendering. And so, but hopefully you have an API test for that hits that URL and you're expecting like a status code of 200. So if that part would be caught before you're executing your UI automation, and it will tell you that, oh, our website is down. I'm getting a 500 server error, for example, and our website is down. So your UI automation is not going to even execute. So opening the URL, that's already going to be solved, because if that part passes, now you can proceed to your UI automation in your pipeline. Part two, you're going to execute a JavaScript command or an API request, and you're going to make sure that an item is added to the cart, and then you're going to assert that that item is added to a cart. So now at this point, if that assertion fails, it just means that something in some logic, either your API or if you're doing it with JavaScript, something went wrong there and the item wasn't added to the cart. There is no other reason that your test will fail at this point except that the item wasn't added to a cart. And your test will do an assertion right there. That's the very first assertion, setting the state, where you say, is the item added to cart successfully? And if it fails, your test says, no, I could not add an item to a cart successfully. And so you know the exact reason. So you shouldn't need to retry because it will never fail for any other reason. That is the exact reason. And so now part two of that is now where we actually start using the UI to finish the checkout process. And that part will be so little, it'll be a couple lines of code, maybe 3 to 5 lines of code, where you're actually finishing the checkout process. And then at the end, you assert that the checkout was successful. And again, when you're asserting that the checkout was successful, there's only 2 potential failures that could really happen. Number one is, again, your website went down while you were doing the test. And so even while you were typing in the fields, your website went down and now you're getting some kind of a server error. So if that happens, yes, that could be flakiness, but that's a much bigger problem for your whole organization, because why is your environment randomly going down? That shouldn't be the case for most of us. So then part 2 that can fail of this test is actually that the user is not able to check out because there's some broken functionality in the application. And so that's exactly what we want. And if it fails, it could only be for that reason, besides the database thing, which if it's the database thing, you definitely need to get that resolved so then it becomes stable. And once your environment is stable, again, the last assertion can only fail for one reason. So you don't need a retry. And so the one other thing I wanted to say about retries is I actually had experience with this where retry logic can actually also hide bugs. So one story that I always tell is I used to work in an organization where we used to process like millions of web requests per second. And so we had a load balanced environment. And I noticed that one of my automated UI tests kept failing like randomly, like literally randomly. It wasn't like, you couldn't figure out why and what was causing it to fail. I just noticed like once every blue moon it would fail. And I'll be like, what's going on? So I sat down with the developer and the DevOps person, and we started digging to try to figure out why does this test keep failing. And what we ultimately figured out was because we had a load balanced environment, one of the servers was actually broken. There was some problem on the server. I don't remember, unfortunately, what the problem was now, but basically, I think it wasn't like caching right or something like that. And so it was broken. And so anytime a web request would end up on that server, it wouldn't work correctly. And so it was actually impacting end users of our application and providing invalid behavior. And so if I put retry logic on that test, I would have hidden that random failure behavior. We would have never found that bug, or maybe our client would have found that bug for us. And then, of course, the problems would have come down on me and would have been like, hey, how did you guys not discover this issue that's costing our clients money, blah, blah, blah. And so I would have actually hidden a potential bug. And I'm sure that can happen in other situations in the real world.
So, Nikolay, we just touched the surface of this blog post. It's over 9,169 words. You have code examples, videos. I will definitely have a link to it in the show notes. So I just want to switch up gears now and cover, I believe you're coming out with a new course. You have a bunch of courses, but this one is on the complete Selenium-Webdriver with Java bootcamp. So I just want to have you share a little bit about what this course is about, who it's going to help, what it's going to cover.
One of the, life lessons that I've learned so far working at SauceLabs and working with so many customers is that obviously Java is the most popular, most demanded Selenium implementation in the world. C# is like number 3, JavaScript is number 2. So my C# course has been very successful. I notice it's been helping a lot of people in the industry. Many people come up to me and be like, hey, Nikolay, thank you so much for creating the course. I learned so much. I'm like super successful at my workplace now with everything. So, and I'm super happy. But now that I work a lot with Java and JavaScript and C#, because there's just so many clients, you have to work with all the different languages. I would go in and I look sometimes for information on how to do Selenium automation with Java. And there's still such a gap in the industry in terms of feeling the knowledge and helping people doing test automation better. So I decided, I want to help. I want to do what I did with my C# course and just do the same thing in Java. I want to basically provide all these lessons that I've learned. I want to provide all the automation best practices, anti-patterns, teach how to do proper Selenium automation using Java, and help as many people as possible, because again, the number one demographic of people using Selenium are using Java. So I'd like to enter that space and help as many people as possible. Hopefully one day, my dream is to cover JavaScript as well and have, courses in all 3, helping as many people as possible. Because one other thing I'm realizing is it's really hard to help people solve problems after they've already either been in the industry for a while and have been doing things their own way, and some things for them are working, some things are not working, but it's much harder to change the minds of people once some things are ingrained. It's almost like, I hate to point to this example, but it's like the tobacco industry, right? You almost want to get people when they're young and hook them when they're young versus when they're older, right? That's why they try to target children. So I want to do the same thing with education. I'm sorry if that was a horrible analogy, but I want to do this. It's they're good, they're smart industry, so I try to copy from smart industries. I want to help people before they actually have some knowledge ingrained in, and some foundations laid out that will be harder to change. I'd rather catch them, instead of saying hey, please follow these patterns and anti-patterns, blah, blah, blah. And then we have to get into an argument about why I recommend things. Sometimes we don't communicate well. So some people think one thing, other people think another. I'd rather start at the very bottom and be like, hey, here's a course, take this course. I've provided the best information that I can in this course. And now hopefully it will help you to take that knowledge, apply it in your workplace, and then you can better succeed. And basically what this course will cover is everything for anyone that wants to get started with Selenium with Java. It will cover Java programming fundamentals. It will cover enough so that you're comfortable writing Java code as an automation engineer, but not too much that you need to get into crazy things like generics and all these other weird topics that maybe are only necessary for programmers. And then, of course, it will cover everything related to Selenium automation patterns and anti-patterns, how to write amazing page object patterns. There's a technique I use called acceptance test-driven automation for creating frameworks in under 60 minutes. I can have a production-ready framework in under 60 minutes ready. And then it'll cover things like Selenium Grid, continuous integration, continuous delivery. So all of this stuff to help you basically succeed.
Okay, Nikolay, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you'd give someone to help them with the Java test automation testing effort, since this is the new course you have available? And what's the best way to find, contact you, or have people learn more about your new course or your other courses on automation?
My number one piece of advice that I would recommend to everybody is stop doing BDD automation. And I know that many BDD enthusiasts will automatically say that's not a right thing to say because BDD automation is not really a thing. BDD is a process. And I completely understand that. And that's why I'm saying to stop BDD automation, because BDD is a process that is aimed to create collaboration and decrease rework and improve communication between the three amigos, the business person, the developer, and the tester. It is not a tool that we use to do test automation. So read my blog post, ultimateqa.com, automation-patterns-anti-patterns, or you can even just search for it, automation patterns, on my blog post. And I go into in depth there why doing automation with like a tool like Cucumber has so many disadvantages. It's literally just technologically disadvantaged compared to other solutions. And you're just creating a larger mountain for you to climb in terms of test automation. I will teach that in the Java course in terms of why you shouldn't do it. And I'll show you examples side by side exactly of what's happening. And if you want to learn more about the Java course, just go to ultimateqa.com/selenium-java. Right now, I'm kind of trying to gauge interest. I'm pretty sure there's interest, but I'm trying to gauge it. So I'm gathering people to figure out how many interested. And then once we have that, we're going to launch an Indiegogo campaign to get funding to make sure that people are interested. And once I have the funding, we will start working on the course. So go over there, add your email, and then I will be in contact with you. We'll let you know when the course is launching. And you can find more of me at ultimateqa.com. All my courses are there. All my blog posts are there that you can take a read. And thank you so much for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Joe. I should definitely do this more often.
Thank you, Nikolay, for your automation awesomeness. For links to everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com/A292. And while you're there, make sure to click on the Try It for Free Today link under the exclusive sponsor section to learn all about SauceLabs' awesome products and services. So that's it for this episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating end-to-end, full-stack automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Head on over to testguild.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and online testing conferences. Make sure to subscribe to join the guild and continue your testing journey. This has been a Joe Colantonio production.